Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining our informational webinar for the Ocean Protection Council's Senate Bill 1 Sea Level Rise Adaptation Planning Grant Program. My name is Megan Williams. I am the Coastal Resilience Program Manager within OPC's Climate Change Program. We do have a few additional OPC staff joining me who will be monitoring the chat as we go and also providing support during the Q&A session. And we are also joined by Coastal Quest staff who are working with us on our complementary Senate Bill 1 Technical Assistance Program, and you'll hear from them later on in the webinar. We have an hour set aside for this webinar. This will give us enough time for us to be able to get through the presentation, and I think we will also have some time at the end to be able to answer some questions. Before we dive into the actual webinar materials and presentation, I do just want to discuss some webinar logistics. So this webinar is being recorded. We do plan to post the recording on our website afterwards. Questions will be answered at the end of the webinar presentation during a Q&A session. And during that session, we just ask that you use either the raise hand function, we can call on you to ask your question, or you can also use the chat and just enter your questions into there, and we will try to keep track of those as well. We do ask that you please reserve very specific questions for email. You can email us at any time, either for those specific questions or if more come up after this webinar at opc-sb1@resources.ca.gov, which is shown here on the slide, and you'll see it many more times throughout this presentation, so you don't need to write it down just yet. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Here's an outline of the presentation material that we will be covering today. Over the course of this webinar, we'll be providing an overview of the Ocean Protection Council, Senate Bill 1, and an explanation of our SB1 grant program. So this includes OPC's SB1 funding overview, the solicitation schedule, applicant eligibility, and funding priorities for the solicitation. Following that, I will lay out the process for how to apply to our grant program and the next steps. And then I'll be passing it over to our SB1 Technical Assistance Program team to cover the overview of the TA program and the process for applying for TA. And then finally, as I've said, we will be moving into accepting questions during the Q&A. Okay, so let's take a big step back and talk about the Ocean Protection Council. So OPC is a cabinet-level state agency that is charged with protecting, conserving, and maintaining California's ocean and marine resources for the benefit of current and future generations. The role of OPC is to recommend policy, lead and promote coordination, seek and leverage funding, inform government decision-making with sound science, and to operate with transparency and accountability. One of our most important documents here at OPC, and really what covers all of our current priorities, is our strategic plan. We are currently in the last year that this strategic plan is covering and are in the process actually of developing our next one that will cover the years of 2026 through 2030. So if you have not yet checked out this document, the current one from 2020 to 2025, I do highly encourage you to do so, as this solicitation that we will be covering in today's webinar is really ultimately meant to implement strategic plan targets and objectives. And the main one for the SB1 grant program is objective 1.1, which is to build resiliency to sea level rise, coastal storms, erosion, and flooding. To provide some background on this program specifically, in 2021, Governor Newsom signed Senate Bill 1 into law. SB1 directs the state to provide funding to local and regional governments to develop sea level rise adaptation plans and implementation projects. While much sea level rise planning and adaptation work has been conducted along California's coast over the past decade, it is currently understood that vulnerability assessments, adaptation plans, and coastal resilience projects are not consistent in their standards or their criteria across jurisdictions. So in recognition of these gaps and recognition of the urgency of preparing for sea level rise, Senate Bill 272 was signed into law in 2023. SB 272 requires that all coastal local governments develop sea level rise plans. With a deadline of January 1st, 2034, these plans must be integrated into local coastal programs for the outer coast or San Francisco Bay sub-regional shoreline adaptation plans for the San Francisco Bay area. In 2022, OPC received $37.5 million for the implementation of SB1. And as of today's webinar in February 2025, About $19.97 million is currently available for funding SB1 projects. The overall goal of OPC's SB1 Sea Level Rise Adaptation Planning Grant Program, or also known as the SB1 Grant Program, is to provide funding for coastal, local, regional, and tribal governments to develop sea level rise adaptation plans and projects to build resilience to sea level rise along the entire coast of California and San Francisco Bay. So as we go through this webinar and we really get into the application process, I do just want us to keep this goal in mind. This program is designed to ensure that all California coastal communities are preparing for sea level rise. So in order to achieve this quite lofty program goal, we have two funding tracks that are available for applicants, depending on which phase of sea level rise adaptation planning is appropriate for the applicant. Phases 1 through 4 reference the phases provided in our sea level rise criteria, which I will be covering shortly. Track 1 proposals, which are projects in the pre-planning, data collection, and planning phases, will be accepted through a quarterly rolling non-competitive process, provided the proposals satisfy the sea level rise criteria and the requirements of our solicitation. Track 2 proposals, or projects in the implementation project phase, will be accepted through a competitive process starting in mid to late 2025, subject to the availability of funding. Since we are only currently accepting track 1 proposals right now, I'm going to be spending the majority of the rest of this webinar discussing for the specifics for track 1 project priorities and the application process. So for track 1 of the SB1 grant program, I've provided this overview here. As I mentioned before, the current amount we have of available funding for the SB1 grant program is $19.97 million. Projects within track 1 can be anywhere between $200,000 to $1.5 million, with a maximum project length being 2 years. And as I mentioned before, track 1 proposals are accepted on a rolling quarterly non-competitive basis, and this next quarter deadline is coming up on March 21st. So here's a bit more of a breakdown of the solicitation and the timeline of the rolling quarterly process and what it looks like. So full proposals will be due approximately 10 to 12 weeks prior to each OPC meeting. For proposals that are submitted by that Friday, March 21st deadline by 5 p.m., the earliest OPC meeting in which those proposals may be considered for funding approval and award is at our June 2025 council meeting. Following the submission of the proposals, the evaluation and the selection of projects will be completed in those 5 to 12 weeks following proposal submission. Preparation for the selected projects to be brought to council meeting for approval of funding will then take place in the weeks leading up to council meeting. And then following official approval for funding at our OPC meetings, the selected grantees will work with OPC staff to build the grant work plan in the first 1 to 3 months after the council meeting, with projects ultimately expected to start about 2 to 4 months following the council meeting, but it is of course case dependent on the grantee. You can find a detailed schedule of the different quarter deadlines and their associated council meetings on our SB1 funding webpage. In 2025, we have council meetings in March, June, September, and December, in which SB1 projects will be considered. Once we have our 2026 council meeting dates, we will update the schedule to include those as well, and so on for the years of 2027 and on. In order to apply for track 1 funding, there is a template for full proposals available on our SB1 funding webpage. You'll find all instructions within the application template form. And there's different sections of the full proposal that have different page limits that I will point out later down the line in this webinar. And as I said, I'll be going into that a little bit more, but just wanted to kind of give you awareness of where you're really ultimately going to be applying and how you're going to be doing so. So now that we've covered some of the basics of the solicitation and the schedule, let's get into who is actually eligible for this grant program. So applicants that are eligible for the SB1 grant program track 1 opportunity consist of local governments, regional governments, and federally recognized tribal governments. Organizations or consultants who apply on a government's behalf may also be considered. However, we do require that there is a display of explicit support and collaboration between the organization and the government, and that can be provided within the application via letter of commitment from the government. OPC intends, as I've mentioned, that the SB1 grant program is to ensure that the entire coast of California, including San Francisco Bay, is preparing for sea level rise. And in order to do so, the program is also intended to support the local and regional governments at any stage that they are at in the sea level rise adaptation planning process. We want to support localized planning efforts, but we also want to ensure that these adaptation planning efforts are consistent and comprehensive across jurisdictions. So to support jurisdictions where they're at in the process, SB1 offers funding for all phases of the planning process for sea level rise. Under track 1, we have phase 1, or the pre-planning phase. This would be for community visioning or vulnerability assessment projects. Phase 2 is the data collection phase, and phase 3 is the planning phase. This is for the creation of an outer coast sea level rise adaptation plan, a multi-jurisdictional or single jurisdiction bay shoreline sub-regional adaptation plan, or a sector-specific plan. The final phase is phase 4, which is housed under track 2. This phase is the project implementation phase, which covers nature-based and green-gray hybrid adaptation projects, feasibility studies, and design plans. As a reminder, track 2 proposals will be accepted through a competitive process later this year, subject to the availability of funding. And again, I'll get into why there's a potential urgent mechanism for projects that are addressing near-term sea level rise projects down the line in a little bit. So while we are intending to support local and regional governments at any stage of the sea level rise adaptation planning process, we are also aiming to ensure that these efforts are consistent and comprehensive across jurisdictions. To achieve this particular goal, OPC staff, alongside the California Sea Level Rise State and Regional Support Collaborative, have developed specific sea level rise adaptation criteria. The sea level rise criteria is a standardized set of minimum standards for each phase of sea level rise adaptation planning and implementation. So when you're developing your projects under the SB1 grant program, adherence to the sea level rise criteria ensures that adaptation plans and projects include the same components and are at the same level and caliber across jurisdictions. While the sea level rise criteria document lists the minimum criteria that projects must meet to be eligible for SB1 grant program funding, we do recognize that certain criteria just may not be applied to an applicant, whether that's due to a unique local condition or because it has already been accomplished by a previous planning effort. And so in those instances, applicants are able to provide sound justification for why a specific criterion will not be included in their project outcome. So the sea level rise criteria are structured to reflect the 4 phases of the sea level rise adaptation planning process. So under phase 1, which is the pre-planning phase, minimum criteria are listed for both community visioning, which are projects that build a consensus on community priorities, they set goals and create a vision for resilience, and then also some criteria listed for the sea level rise vulnerability assessments. For the data collection phase, which is phase 2, this is really just the opportunity to fill in missing pieces to either pre-planning or planning efforts that are already underway, and provides an opportunity to achieve some criteria that may be either missing from phase 1 or phase 3. So this phase must support the completion of either a phase 1 project or a phase 3 project. So maybe a vulnerability assessment is already completed, it's pre-existing, but there's one core sector that's missing. So data collection could be the opportunity to fill in some of those gaps under a phase 1 project. Under the planning phase, the minimum criteria is provided for outer coast sea level rise adaptation plans, multi-jurisdictional and single jurisdiction San Francisco Bay sub-regional shoreline plans, and sector-specific adaptation plans. Both the outer coast and San Francisco Bay shoreline adaptation plans are expected to be at the city, county, or regional level and are more comprehensive in scope. Sector-specific plans are those that pertain to a specific core sector with significant vulnerability and adaptation needs, and that should be more localized in their approach. So these plans may be necessary if a core sector was omitted from a previously completed adaptation plan. It maybe requires more detail or complex adaptation planning process, or has shown a recently intensified vulnerability to the impacts of sea level rise. So an example of a sector-specific plan might be planning for an entire wastewater system or a critical transportation corridor. And then lastly, we do have minimum criteria for phase 4, which is the nature-based and green-gray hybrid adaptation projects, feasibility studies, and designs. Phase 4 projects can also include funding for permitting and CEQA. And starting in mid to late 2025, Track 2 or Phase 4 proposals will be accepted through a competitive process, and information on how to submit a Track 2 proposal will be made available at that time. However, OPC does recognize the importance of funding timely implementation projects, and therefore during this interim period between the release of this Track 1 solicitation and the opening of and acceptance of Track 2 proposals, we are considering urgent projects. An urgent project is one that addresses near-term sea level rise threats, meets phase 4 sea level rise criteria requirements, and has completed necessary planning work. So if you do feel that you have a project that meets these requirements, you can review the solicitation under the section Track 2 Proposals and Urgent Phase 4 Projects for more information about that. Again, we do recognize that the status of sea level rise planning across the coast varies, and while many jurisdictions have advanced planning already underway or complete, many others have yet to begin comprehensive planning or assessments. So we are really aiming to address this need by offering funding for a range of sea level rise planning activities. And if you feel that addressing one of these phases or many of these phases in the sea level rise pre-planning or planning process is needed within your jurisdiction, we do encourage you to apply for submitting a full proposal. To apply, please first review our SB1 program solicitation and the sea level rise adaptation criteria. Adhering to those sea level rise criteria will really be critical when you're scoping and creating the project. And while the solicitation contains evaluation criteria, that will also be used when reviewing the Track 1 proposal. So really critical to read that section as well to understand what we're looking for when you are crafting your full proposal. If your project is under phase 1 or phase 2, so community visioning, a vulnerability assessment, or data collection, or you are completing an outer coast sea level rise adaptation plan, or either multi-jurisdictional or single jurisdiction sub-regional shoreline adaptation plan for the Bay Area, you can download the SB1 Track 1 proposal template, and you can fully complete per the instructions that are located within the proposal template document. If you are applying to complete a sector-specific adaptation plan, we do ask that you first download, complete, and submit a sector-specific letter of intent. We will then review that letter of intent and determine the next course of action, which may be either consultation or follow-up questions, or being able to submit a full proposal. And we just ask that you do that for the sector-specific adaptation plans because we do feel that this is a very limited circumstance and case, and so we do not want you to go through the full effort of doing a sector-specific plan only to find out that it's really more eligible for Track 2. So this is trying to potentially limit the extra effort on your behalf and understanding where your project might be most applicable. Once you have either the full proposal or this sector-specific letter of intent, you can send your completed package to opc-sb1@resources.ca.gov with the subject line main applicant name, Track 1 project, proposal, or letter of intent by 5 p.m. on March 21st in order to be considered for the June 2025 OPC meeting. All of these documents that I've been talking about and all these materials are able to be found within our SB1 solicitation and on our SB1 funding webpage. And I believe Ella will be able to drop a link into the chat that links you to that SB1 funding webpage with all these materials in there. Okay, so we have covered a lot. I know we want to get into understanding what actually goes into a proposal itself. So this is really giving an overview of that Track 1 proposal template. So that includes section 1, which is a cover page. This is where you'll fill in summary information for your project, contact info, and also contact information and a brief description of the role of subcontractors that might be a part of the application team. So there's a list of information to fill out for that first subcontractor on page 1. And then if you have multiple, you can just copy and paste that information for each additional subcontractor. Additionally, there's a question that asks which phases of the Seal of Rise adaptation planning process you are addressing in the proposal, and you'll be able to select all that apply. Doing that accurately is really important for us, just to be able to know which of the Seal of Rise criteria we want to compare your proposal against. So ensuring that you are taking the time to think through that question and selecting the right boxes will be really important. Section 2 of the template is an application completeness checklist, which you should revisit and fill out as you're preparing your final proposal for submission. All the sections are required, as well as most of the supplemental documents, with a few exceptions that are described in the footnotes on the checklist page. And then starting in section 3 is the actual application space. So this starts with the project description for section 3. For sections 3 through 7, you should draft your responses to the prompts below each of the headings, and you can delete the instruction text to ensure you can maximize your page limit. Please keep your responses in Calibri, the font that it already is in, size 12. And under section 3, you are asked to answer prompts that provide us with a summary of the project, project description, the relative need for Seal of Rise planning and the likelihood of success, a community description, and tribal partnership if applicable. And then lastly, for this section, we do also require a map of the project area. Section 4, which is the project work plan, is where addressing the minimum criteria within the Seal of Rise criteria really comes into play. So each criterion that's listed in the Seal of Rise criteria for your particular phase that you've selected is required to be incorporated into the project's work plan. However, as I mentioned, if certain criteria don't apply to your project or to the applicant, whether that's due to a unique local condition or because it's already been accomplished by a previous planning effort, you are able to provide an explanation and justification for that in section 5. Next slide. Okay, section 6 of the proposal is the project schedule and major deliverables, where you will provide a timeline of the different tasks and the major deliverables that will be completed as and provided as part of your project. Section 7 is the budget. When you are creating your budget, please follow the prompts found within the proposal and also refer to OPC's budget and invoicing guide, which is linked in that section, to understand what each of the line items within the budget template that you're provided entails. In that budget and invoicing guide, it's also really important to look at a list of the items and costs that cannot be included into the project budget so that you ensure you aren't adding something that will have to be taken out down the line. And then within section 7, that budget, you are also asked to provide a detailed budget justification. And then finally is section 8, which is the supplemental document section. So here you will attach your project team's resumes or your CVs. If the lead applicant is a nonprofit organization, so applying on behalf of a government and they're a nonprofit, the nonprofit questionnaire must also be completed and included in this section as well. If you are applying for a Bay Area adaptation plan, so either a multi-jurisdictional or single jurisdiction sub-regional shoreline adaptation plan, then you also need to fill out the supplemental questionnaire and include that within this section. And that is linked under section 8, as well as on the SB1 funding webpage. And then finally are the project letters. This includes letters of support and commitment, tribal resolutions, etc. So within this section on the proposal template, it lays out the various scenarios where letters are required versus where they are optional. So for instance, if you are an organization that's applying on behalf of a local government, you do require a letter of commitment from the local government demonstrating the buy-in and the support for you carrying out this project. If a proposal is for a multi-jurisdictional sub-regional adaptation plan, then letters of commitment from all the participating counties and cities are required. And then other letters of commitment and support are strongly encouraged to demonstrate community buy-in and general support for the project, but they are not required. The final proposal submission should be one PDF that includes this proposal template and all of these supplemental documents, the letters, the CVs, everything all in one PDF. OPC staff will, as I've said, provide applicants the opportunity to ask questions throughout this process. This is a grant program that is still relatively new. It's really just entering into its second year, and we have a really large goal. So we want to ensure that this process is very straightforward and easy to navigate. And so we really welcome questions throughout this process and are always learning and trying to adjust the grant program to meet the needs of the applicants. So in addition to today's Q&A session that's happening very shortly, we will also host a virtual office hours on February 26th at 2 p.m. You can find the registration link for that on our SB1 funding webpage. And then as I mentioned, today's webinar recording will also be made available on our SB1 funding webpage within hopefully the next couple of weeks. At any time throughout this process, you can also email us through the OPC SB1 email that's shown on the screen. And then we also have a fact sheet that contains questions and answers that's posted on our SB1 webpage. And we update this to include questions that are relevant for everyone that we do receive. Okay, so I have now gone through my spiel. We've covered the overview of the SB1 grant program, the application requirements, and the actual process for applying and what the proposal really covers. So I'd now like to pass it over to our SB1 Technical Assistance Program team, who will walk us through the overview of our complimentary SB1 TA program and the process for applying for TA if you are interested. So Emma, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Megan, for that handoff, and thank you to OPC for inviting us to this webinar. Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Kuzi, and I'm a director at Coastal Quest. At Coastal Quest, I work with our team to design and implement TA programs, such as the SB1 TA program. And I want to highlight once more that it is a complementary TA program. So very excited to chat with you about it today. Before we dive in, next slide, please. I want to give you a little overview of what we're going to chat about before the Q&A session starts. First, I'll introduce you to Coastal Quest, the organization. Then I'll dive into the mechanics of the SB1 TA program and tell you about the services that we can offer, as well as some key dates to mark on your calendars if you are interested in receiving TA. Last but not least, we'll touch on the TA program process, talk about how easy it is to apply for TA through a Google form, which I highly encourage you to do if you qualify or even if you are unsure if you qualify. Next slide, please. So what is it that we do at Coastal Quest? Well, Coastal Quest is a service-focused nonprofit based out of Oakland, California, and our mission is to work with partners to accelerate solutions to build resilient coastal communities for people, nature, and the climate. We're very committed to catalyzing positive change by placing communities at the forefront of all that we do and of course, climate resilience and adaptation efforts. Next slide, please. Our work increases the resilience of coastal communities and economies. Likewise, we work to build multi-benefit solutions for healthy and resilient coasts. So all of our work focuses on achieving both of those goals, which is why we're here today and why we're working with OPC on the SB1 TA program. Next slide, please. Now, time for the good stuff that you're all here to hear about. The SB1 TA program, like I said, is a complementary technical assistance program aimed at helping eligible applicants check all of the boxes on their grant proposals for the SB1 grant program. The program targets eligible SB1 grant applicants or qualifying jurisdictions that are facing significant and imminent sea level rise threats along the California coast and the San Francisco Bay shoreline. So what is it that we offer? Next slide, please. So this slide, back one, please. Perfect. This slide reflects the current tableau of TA services that we offer under Track 1, which Megan explained so beautifully, so pre-planning and planning phases. Please note that as Track 2 opens, these technical assistance services are subject to change. As you can see, our TA services range from helping an applicant understand SB1 grant requirements to offering grant rating assistance, grant writing review, or even GIS mapping support, and more. We also hope to offer TA to as many qualifying applicants as is possible, or eligible jurisdictions that are facing, like I said before, significant sea level rise vulnerability as compared to other jurisdictions. If you are identified as an eligible entity, you will receive the services under intake as a baseline. Furthermore, the low, medium, and high TA services that you see on this slide will be determined upon intake or when we have our initial Zoom call. The services that an applicant receives are determined based upon an applicant's needs and desires, as well as whether or not the applicant represents a priority community under the prioritization criteria that we will discuss shortly. But first, next slide, please. It's important to discuss a few key dates in the interest of offering helpful and thorough TA and ensuring the TA assistance capacity from our team. We encourage applicants to apply for technical assistance sometime before the OPC grant proposal rolling deadlines. So if interested in applying for the SB1 grant by the March 21st deadline, we encourage applicants to apply for TA really as soon as possible. But the February 28th date is a great benchmark. Sometime before then would be ideal. Next slide, please. Thank you. The prerequisite criteria for the TA program is that eligible jurisdictions must have a demonstrated relative need for sea level rise planning. Additionally, in order to be prioritized for TA and receive any needed TA services with priority even when or if demand for TA is high, our team has identified 4 key prioritization criteria. For one, the jurisdiction could represent a coastal or shoreline environmental justice community. Additionally, the applicant might be a federally recognized tribe or tribal partner. In a moment, I will go into more detail on what we mean by tribal partner. Another prioritized community is a jurisdiction that represents a small and rural community. And last but not least, the final prioritization criterion that I would like to talk about is an applicant might face other locally specific barriers to sea level rise adaptation planning. As we know, different localities face their own unique challenges, and we want to account for that. I will now deep dive, but hopefully in an efficient way so we can get to Q&A into these prioritization criteria so that you might better understand what we're looking for. So first, prioritization can be determined through the presence of, like I said, a coastal or shoreline environmental justice community within the eligible jurisdiction. EJ communities are communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental injustices and social inequities and are historically underserved. EJ communities along the California coast and San Francisco Bay shoreline can be identified as outlined here on this slide. Additionally, if you explore the criteria explanation document, which I can drop in the chat, you can find links to these tools that are referenced here. We have chosen several tools that identify different indicators that signal environmental justice communities. And while these tools are useful for identifying the presence of EJ communities on a map, they are not all encompassing, and we are very aware of that. Limitations to these tools exist, as indicators that might signal an EJ community are not all represented, and that is just one example of a limitation. Due to the admitted limitations of these tools, EJ communities can fall through the cracks, and for this reason, regionally or locally defined communities can also qualify as EJ communities. And upon intake, we will allow jurisdictions to make a case for their community based on locally specific data. Next slide, please. Thank you. In addition to the environmental justice criterion we just discussed, we also prioritize federally recognized tribes or tribal partners. The SB1TA program aims to address the historical injustices against all California Native American tribes. This in mind, federally recognized tribes, along with applicants that intend to build meaningful partnerships with both federally and non-federally recognized tribes, will be prioritized to receive TA. Next slide, please. Additionally, the SB1TA program team acknowledges that small and rural communities are often subject to their own set of climate adaptation challenges, including distance from critical services and infrastructure disinvestment. Additionally, local government agencies in small and rural communities are often constrained on staffing and other capacity, making it challenging for them to respond to funding opportunities and fill planning gaps. So jurisdictions with small and rural communities, as outlined here on this slide, will also be prioritized for technical assistance. Next slide, please. Last but not least, the TA team understands that locally specific barriers to planning vary significantly and are not all covered by the 3 previous prioritization criteria. And that is the role of this here. Other barriers to sea level rise adaptation planning really offers an opportunity for applicants to check any boxes that apply to their locality in addition to what we already covered. Locally specific barriers might include, for example, a jurisdiction has not yet completed a sea level rise vulnerability assessment, an adaptation strategy, or a sea level rise plan update. Next slide, please. I will try to breeze through the TA application process so that you all have time to ask any questions that you have. If you apply for the Technical Assistance Program through the Initiation Google form, we will follow up with an intake call. Then on our intake call, we will assess your technical assistance needs, ensure that you're eligible, and then from there, technical assistance really begins. All of this is to say, if you are a qualifying local or regional government along the coast or the bay, or a tribe, a federally recognized tribe, or organization looking to apply on behalf of a governmental partner, we really encourage you to apply for TA today. That is my spiel. I'm going to drop the initiation form in the chat now, and then just briefly tell you a little bit more about what that initiation form looks like. Next slide, please. So you can either access the initiation form through the link that I just sent. Otherwise, you'll find it on the SB1 funding page on the OPC website. There you'll find the TA initiation form by clicking the Apply Now button. And I also dropped it in the chat, as I mentioned. Filling out the initiation form should not take longer than 20 minutes. We want thorough answers, but we also want applicants to finish the application over achieving perfection, and we're here to help fill in the gaps. Once you've filled the application out to the best of your ability, submit your form, and we will be in touch as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So this is just to say that the first half of the SB1 TA initiation form consists of general questions that aim to determine your eligibility under SB1. We ask for generic information like the name of your organization, whether you represent a city, a county, special district, and so on and so forth. Additionally, we ask a few more in-depth questions. I can briefly show you some examples on the next slide, please. Thank you. For one, we want to hear about the proposal that you have in mind. This proposal or project idea does not need to be fully fleshed out, however. A proposal might include the city of X in partnership with the city of Y hopes to apply for funds for a phase 3 sea level rise adaptation plan, as no plan currently exists for the region. Full stop, you can submit that. Furthermore, we want to know if your jurisdiction is facing a demonstrated need for sea level rise adaptation planning due to increased effects of sea level rise or other coastal hazards. Next slide, please. So in brief, the last portion of the initiation form consists of questions that help us determine your TA needs, as well as if you represent prioritized communities like the prioritization criteria we discussed a little bit ago. This will inform the level of TA that you might receive and help inform us as to how we might best help you. Next slide, please. In short, apply now. We're here to help, and we look forward to talking to you about your proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much. Okay, well, that concludes the presentation portion for this webinar. So we would like to open it up for questions. We have a good 15 minutes or so for that. So as I mentioned before, please feel free to just use that raise hand function to be called on, or you can type questions into the chat. If there are already questions in the chat, we can start with those. And then I will just say again, with just 15 minutes left, depending on the amount of times or for really specific questions, you can also email us at opc-sb1@resources.ca.gov. If you have a TA program-specific question, that can be to opcsb1ta@coastal-quest.org. If you mix those up for any reason, we are in very close coordination and communication, so we can always pass it on to the correct inbox. So really, as long as you email one of these, your question will get answered. And then just before I stop sharing my screen and opening it up for questions, I do just want to say thank you all so much for your interest in our Senate Bill 1 grant program. We're really looking forward to receiving and reviewing your applications soon.